We've got about 40 country offices, and we have 13 dedicated technical specialists that just deal with skills development work scattered around the different regions. And so that sort of work typically involves engaging with our constituents, and the ILO is a tripartite organisation, so if you're a member of the ILO, you actually have 3 people that represent your interests around the ILO table, and that's employers, workers and government. So the question of employer engagement and skills development is pretty central to what we do. I've only been with them for about 8 years or so, but one of the jobs I did previously, I managed a state industry training advisory board, like a sector skills council in Australia, and so the question of employer engagement and skills is pretty important, and I think that question about whether or not we're just pushing an orthodoxy around yes it must be good. I mean, I think there is some element to that, but I think it's because it is. I think there's enough evidence out there to suggest that it is actually a good idea. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Karina.
Hello, I'm Karina Veal. I'm with the Asian Development Bank. Been there for 4 years. Employer engagement is not central to what we do. Our client is very clearly the government of the country. We finance governments to do what they need to do to help develop the country economically, socially. Most of that is for infrastructure. Most of what governments want to borrow money for is to build a new hydro dam, to put a new set of roads in, to put a new energy power station in. We're a very small part of that, but vocational training is the fastest growing part of education. So it's something governments are interested in. But our clients are the ministries of education or labour, depending, which country, which one it is. And so they do tend to come at it from a fairly government perspective. We do suggest employer engagement, but I think this would be a point of difference between the ILO and ADB, is we don't have employers and workers at the core around the table of our work. Our client is clearly the government, and sometimes we are moving ahead of the government on these issues of involving employers or involving workers. It's coming from us rather than from the government.
Okay. Karina, thank you very much indeed. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, I'm Bohrene Chakroun. I'm the chief of the section leading the work of UNESCO in technical and vocational education and training, and I'm based in Paris. I joined UNESCO 5 years ago. Before UNESCO, I was working for the European Training Foundation, where Julian is now working. I spent 10 years there, and before that I've worked as a trainer. I worked as a consultant also for companies who were investing in vocational training, and in particular in their own workers. And I do believe that this is an area that is also equally important, in addition to investing in youth, is how companies are investing in their own workers. And I believe that that's a good signal. If companies are investing in their own workers, they will be more open to investing in youth, and the way they are managing their human resources has implication on the way they will engage in apprenticeship or other forms, or engage with colleges or schools. So I think this is something that we might come back to that later. But basically our work is at 3 levels. One is a more kind of normative work, in the sense that, for example, we adopted a recommendation on technical and vocational education and training last year, and that recommendations is a kind of prescriptive document that tells member states what are the areas that they have to advance in technical and vocational education and training. And of course, the issue of employers and engagement with employers is one of the area that is mentioned there. We have another type of work which is about policy advice and policy support, and we engage with member states in developing their own technical and vocational education and training system, and obviously the partnership with the employers is one of the element of the policies. It's very generic, in the sense that most of the countries in the world are saying employers are in the driving seat. We want to develop a partnership, employers will be engaged, but then the question is how you do that, where you can start, how you do that taking into account the context of your own country, the reality of the economy, the reality of the companies that constitute your economy. That's a kind of a question that is to be asked. And the third level of is more an operational intervention. We have projects in different countries where we are trying to support countries in setting up this partnership, be it through work-based learning, be it through engaging in qualification reforms, in developing sector councils or platforms for collaboration. So that's the level also of intervention that we do have, and I will come back to that later.
For the sake of completion, I'll just say my name is Julian Stanley. I work at the European Training Foundation, which is maybe an organisation which is less familiar than these other organisations. The European Training Foundation is an agency of the European Union, and it's not concerned about vocational education in Europe, which is another agency's job. It's concerned about vocational education in the neighbouring countries, the 29 countries in around the Mediterranean, in Southeast and Eastern Europe, and even in Central Asia, who are Europe's partners, neighbours. And we try and work with those countries to share good practice with them about vocational education and training, about employment, and to support them in kind of improving their systems. I mean, part of the logic is that some of these countries would like to become members of the European Union, and it's a condition of their doing so to have improved, systems and standards in these areas. So, but that doesn't apply to all of them. But in general, it's a way in which Europe feels it can support its neighbours and have good understanding and of course, trade and other kinds of exchange with them. I mean, for my organisation, driven by European policy and European thinking about this, it's kind of axiomatic. I'm a little bit, I need to be careful here, I'm a bit, sometimes a bit critical about it. It's kind of axiomatic that education needs to be improved by making it more responsive to the world of work. I mean, that's kind of starting principle. Everything comes from that. So you start from that idea, and then you say, right, how can we do that? And you say, well, employers, we should listen to them, or we should give them more power, or they should do this, they should do that, if you see what I mean. And that idea of making education responsive, so it's more efficient in some kind of sense, it's giving, and of course there's a little bit of a gap, isn't there? I mean, making education more responsive is not quite the same as giving more power to employers.
Right.
I mean, one of them might be the means to the other, but then again it might not. I mean, it depends a little bit how good the employers are bringing that about, okay? But it is kind of wired into my organisation that this is a way, and because it's part of European policy. I mean, it's a fundamental way of, kind of using education to drive smart growth in Europe, which is a fundamental policy agreement in Europe.
Can I comment on that? You just said it depends how much the employers cut in and bring in the stuff on from the employer perspective to respond to that question of the relevance. But equally, you could say how well the education system responds to the messages about it. Yeah. So there's that fantastic bit of research. I do think we do need employers more involved, but there's a terrific bit of research done by McKinsey Institute for the World Economic Forum, where they surveyed, loads of, substitute the correct number, I don't know how many it is, of employers, and distilled the wisdom of what employers are looking for. So instead of having one local employer advising this local college, they actually went up a bit and said, well, look, thinking of all these hundreds of things we've read and all this big survey, we can tell you that what employers are looking for in the year 2020, they do it every 5 years, are this, and this. Yeah. And that's different from what they were looking for 2015. Yeah. And the shift, by the way, is away from the social skills. The 2015 list had more about teamwork, collaboration, communication skills, and the 2020 list has more on creativity and critical thinking. So these are more employers in more developed countries, it's true to say, but I guess there are other ways of picking up those messages, aren't there? You could respond to those messages and probably be more on target than asking your local employer down the road. So it's a matter of how to get the messages, not always
I think
reaching
that's
out to a
right.
neighbour.
I think that's absolutely right. I think once you start to be aware there are different ways of listening, there are different people you can listen to, there are different different fora where you can meet them, and then you and of course which mode you use will affect which message you hear. And if you want to hear a particular message, you may choose a particular mode.
Yes.
Some of the complexity of it unravels a bit.
Yes, I think.
And I think that the question of skills mismatch sort of comes in there too, doesn't it? In terms of about whether or not the supply of skills into a labour market is meeting the demand of employers. Now, that's the statistical measures. Even yesterday, the point you made yesterday in that presentation about PISA and OECD, and so conclusions are drawn about skills demand. But when you actually look at the testing that's being done, only three skills are being tested, but conclusions about skills are drawn from the data. So there's this question about, well, what skills are you really talking about? But I think, because we always sort of make the skills mismatch issue problematic, that it's not just about skills, it's about what wages are on offer, what the working conditions are, whether there's a career path, whether the job is in the place where someone wants to move to, all those other factors that play down, I guess, the significance of skills mismatch. Now, people can argue that, and that's fair enough because there's obviously heterogeneous labour markets. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think often the education training system is on a hiding to nothing. They're never going to sort of meet the demands of industry. So they're always a sort of a whipping boy, and I think the constant tinkering that government does around policy reforms and stuff. It's about playing with what's inside the box, to meet the demands of employers. And I think often we get focused on supply side reform instead of looking at really what demand is about, and whether or not there's actual demand in industry, what employers are doing to actually drive demand. Are they serious about skills in their own enterprises? Are they serious about developing skills in their enterprises, or do they just see it as someone else's problem and therefore someone else's responsibility? I think, like some of that work that you at Keep's done here, mapping sort of policy reforms and really, seeing it as a way of industry really to, devolve their responsibility in the skills system by saying, well, it's it's a supply issue, you fix it. And I think so, putting the heat on employers in terms of you've got to, focus on skills, the question of skills utilisation, instead of, screaming about skills mismatch. You actually know what skills you've got in your enterprise. Are you actually linking, the development of those skills to your business strategy and your market strategy or whatever? And are you actively engaged in the process of managing that skills? And so there's that dynamic. There's the CSR dynamic, which has a role in developing countries. India with the levy now, people are having to do that. Financing, other mechanisms to get engagement. But I think fundamentally there's, we have to try and shift some of that responsibility back the other way.
I think it's very, the logic is that education is to a large extent controlled by the state, it's paid by the state, and therefore you can make demands of it, as it were. It's much more difficult for policymakers to drive the private sector. There are instances that you've alluded to. So driving the sort of employment policy, trying to improve what jobs are offered, trying to create more high-skilled jobs, trying to get employers to engage positively in education. It's difficult to think what the tools are. I'm not saying there aren't some tools, but there appear to be fewer tools on the shelf than there are tools for demanding changes in education. And therefore somehow education is asked to do more work, not necessarily because it can solve the problem by itself, but because there's better methods to make education do more. I don't know. It just sort of seems like that to me. When my organisation, the European Training Foundation, changed Director General in the European Union, it was moved from education into employment. I got very excited because I thought that's great. You know, they're moving us into employment, and now, you know, policies about education can be linked to policies about employment. And, you know, the two will join up. I'm waiting. I mean, but you know, I mean, it's yeah. Yeah, Bohrene, do you want to?
Maybe a few points. First of all, on this, I think we are using a paradigm that has to change a bit in this dichotomy, demand and supply. But in reality, it's not as simple as such. I think there is a demand in the supply, and there is supply in the demand. In the sense that, first of all, there is in many cases we are using work-based learning and workplace learning, and that's a kind of an integration between demand and supply. In many countries you have, and we have heard yesterday, you have incubators, you have other forms of, or say, entrepreneurship that are happening in the supply side, and that's about the demand. So I think that dichotomy has to be looked at more carefully, given the fact that also the economy is not creating as much as jobs as there is a demand for it, and I think we will need to rely maybe more on understanding that there will be more need for people to create their own employment rather than to get wage jobs. So that's one thing that I think important to look at. There is another point that we discussed yesterday is when we speak about private sector, we have also to be, or employers, we have to be maybe more specific. There are companies that are well structured, that are in a way organized and with the human resource management department, etc., that are able to express their needs in maybe structured way. But then in other countries we have the informal sector. In other countries you have even rural areas where there is no companies, and there is understanding the employer's concept is a bit different. And we are having a new economy that is emerging, that is most probably will be jobs which are in a way in the virtual or say global internet, where people are working from distance, they are doing teleworking, they are working for them as a self-employees. And for example, if we take the case of France, we have a status which is an independent worker, and that independent worker is millions of people. So when we say enterprises and employers, I think we have to be careful how we are clustering and organizing, and what does it mean in terms of skills expression or demand and skills supply. And I think that's something that we need to put in the discussion in a more serious way than before, because I think till now we have been all the time talking about enterprises that are able to express their needs and a survey that will help understanding what's the demand. But in reality, that's not true. And we have to shift. Maybe we have to create another type of instrument. And one of the instruments that I think is interesting in Denmark, where it's not only employers in traditional sense and providers that are coming together, but employers, training providers, university leaders, and that type of platform seems to me becoming more important and more interesting and more in a way more relevant than a traditional sector council where you have employers or maybe in some cases you have social partners, meaning employers and union. I think we need this diversity of perspective and stakeholders, and there are very few countries who have developed this type of platforms.
Is there anyone who would like to come in here at this point? Yeah, come in. Please, can you give your name, please?
My name is Tony Coultis from Skills Development Scotland.
Right.
Listening to Paul, I was going to ask, so in the UK, a new instrument has been introduced, the Levy, to support the employer engagement in skills. So how do we make that effective? You know, what are the characteristics do you think of making the levy work?
Well, I mean, in fact, the two presentations that I got the most out of in the conference were the two about apprenticeships yesterday morning, and just getting a better sense of, you know, how that's unfolding and what some of the consequences have been, and, you know, that thing about how I think there was that guy, that large employer, that said, well, you know, we've worked out that the gap between the money we're paying into the levy and what we're actually getting back by our entry-level places, there's a gap of £6 million. So we're going to, you know, develop more apprenticeship standards at higher levels for existing workers and use that as a way to get our money back. But also, you know, there's obviously HR spin-offs in terms of, you know, more strategic management. Now, I mean, to me, that's a great, you know, a good development. You might not be hitting the target of getting more 16 to 20-year-olds, you know, into apprenticeship commencements, but you know what you are getting, if that's what happens on a broader scale, you know, I think is a great development, and the potential of apprenticeships to move into that higher learning level and really, you know, blur those boundaries in terms of sectoral divisions and also what pathways are possible within different occupational areas. I mean, I like that comment that Simon Field made about, you know, forget about trying to get parity of esteem, and in some ways I agree with that. But it's whether or not it's a dead end or somewhere that'll lead you, because you can't, you know, move away from, you know, the appeal of higher education, particularly in developed countries, I think, where it really does, you know, you saw some of the data like from Latin America that was put up, the imbalance in, you know, people going into the vet sector versus the higher education sector is really probably more substantial than here. But, you know, levies, I actually think, picking up on Bohrene's point about the future of work and the changing, you know, employment relationship, you can see the potential possibly for more levies being introduced, because you know, if you are moving to more of a crowd surfing gig economy type thing, you know, so there's this argument, well, who pays? Is the individual, the company, or government? And if employers are not going to be paying because they don't have employees, you know, they just have contractors, then, you know, how do you get that contribution into the system? And I think levies possibly do have a greater potential. And I think the Singaporean experience with levies, you know, how it was very much targeted at, well, you give us your money, but we'll only give it back to you if you spend it on, for example, higher level qualifications, or you can't spend it on less than level 3, you have to spend it on training for higher levels. And they provide support businesses to actually think about, okay, well, we've got to focus on higher levels, what some innovation inputs that can go into the enterprise. So you know, it's not just skills, it's about, well, what's happening with work organisation, what's happening with technology, what's happening with industrial relations, and how do they all come together to help an enterprise to grow. So I you know, that joined up kind of thinking around what's the levy doing and how can that support, you know, what else we want to happen in enterprises seems to be where the opportunity is.
Bohrene, you want to?
Yeah, let me pick up, because I think this is a very important point, is that the levy has been seen as a financial instrument, which is of course true, but I think this function of steering the system and steering innovation, steering the priorities, seems to be overlooked or not considered as it should be. And I think the experience shows that the training funds that worked well are the training funds that are not just financial instrument, but they are a moment and platform for partnership between employers, but not only employers. In many cases, these are social partners, meaning employers and union, and the government. And it is used as a lever for orienting the system toward the policy target. So I would see that direction more useful and more relevant than just considering the levy as the incentive to get enterprises engaged in an apprenticeship only.
Yes.
I'm just curious about
Ian
Power from Sydney, Australia. But, I'm just wondering what safeguards are built into systems where there are levies, so that it doesn't cause a skew in the marketplace. And thinking of particularly the large employers where they're kind of manipulating the system to create apprenticeships in areas within their own silo rather than the national interest and national skills agenda, and money that should be going into small SMEs and other areas to plug holes in skills gaps across the entire nation is now being kind of manipulated just within some large companies, trying to minimise the impact of the levy.
But that depends where you set the boundaries.
And that's what I'm wondering about the safeguards. What safeguards can be in place when you design a system like that that's
You would design it so that
very
there
easy
is-
for a business to manipulate within their own boundaries?
Yes, and I think you can assume that a company will have more of its own interest at heart rather than looking at the national.
Yes.
Make that as an assumption. So it does
Guarantee that.
depend.
I'll guarantee that.
Guarantee that, in fact. So really, it depends where you put the limits. You know, if you've got a window, if you're collecting money for everyone, but then you've got a window that's available there, or if you're collecting only from large, but you've got a window that's supporting a fund window that's supporting small and medium, then that would do it. If you have it universally, and then only the large ones get back to the larger proposals, then it will be self-perpetuating. So I think that kind of, you know, I think you can look to make some difference of that.
Bohrene, you want to come back on this?
Well, we mapped around 70 countries, which, I mean, all over the world we have now more or less 70 countries who introduced in form or another a levy, because sometimes it's not only a levy, it can be a tax on value of products, for example, for agriculture, etc. So we have mapped around 70 countries, and the reality shows that there are some countries where you pay and you get back, but there are countries where you are pooling resources within the same sector across type of companies. You have countries where you are pooling resources across sectors. And you have countries where you are putting resources between formal and informal sector. So even companies that are not paying are benefiting from the levy or from the training fund. I think that's of course part of the national dialogue and the engagement with the employers, the lobbying capacities of employers and their capacity to steer a bit the training fund. But again, that's why the training fund shouldn't be seen, or the levy shouldn't be seen just as a financial instrument. It's highly political instrument. If it is considered, and the point that Paul was referring to, Singapore is an example of country. Of course, Singapore cannot be representative of the word diversity, and it has its own context. But obviously, it's a country where there was explicit strategy from the government to use the training fund and the levy to steer the system together with the employers. That was not the case, for example, in countries like South Africa, where the sector on the SETAs, to use the acronym, were not functioning well, and money was there without being spent. And that's why the government decided to reform these setters. So I think the reality is that we have a quite wide range of experiences, and most probably it's about the capacity of engaging with the social partners and who the powers of the different stakeholders in place.
Sorry, let me just come out. I mean, I do think this issue of governance, if I can put it like that, is, you know, deserves some reflection. These organisations where you're trying to bring employers in, you're trying to give them ownership, you're trying to benefit from them and their understanding, their capacity for mobilising resources, but you're doing that with other stakeholders, and you're trying to create the kind of governance organisations, sometimes, you know, without there being much background in that. Or sometimes you are, but sometimes not, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And trying to establish rules for them to operate by, and kind of decide, you know, how who's really in charge, you know, what, you know, how are the decisions made, what the balance of power is. I mean, this is difficult, and learning about what has worked and what has not worked. I mean, in my personal experience, I remember in the UK I was involved in one of these organisations, and there were terrible rows. And this was when working on the diplomas. I mean, there were terrible rows about, you know, who should decide, who had the last word, and complicated. You know, in the end, the government had to bring in management consultants to try and negotiate something which was acceptable to all parties, because people, you know, just wouldn't agree on it. So sort of an understanding of these governance mechanisms, once you bring employers into controlling funds, or it's tricky, I think. So Paul, you want to?
Well, I mean, this question about you know, whether or not the training that's funded by the levy is enterprise specific or has a broader you know, application across a sector. And you know, yesterday the point was made that, you know, the shift from the framework system of apprenticeships to this more very much enterprise-based system, you know, you lose that. And I guess, you know, that issue, I know one of the differences, say, between you know, sector skills councils here and industry advisory bodies elsewhere is, you know, in some other places they're tripartite by sort of design, whereas here the tripartism is a bit more sort of ad hoc and negotiated and depends on the sector, because it's that issue of mobility and you know, taking a view that says, well, what skills are needed across a sector rather than in a particular enterprise, I guess, is where you get that balance in the design of qualifications. But coming back to the fund, I mean, one thing I picked up about Malaysia, where there's a National Human Resource Development Fund, you know, they collect money from SMEs as well as large enterprises, but the SMEs basically weren't getting the money back. So the money was going in, but because of the transaction cost and the bureaucracy around it, they weren't accessing the system, and it was just seen as a tax, and they weren't getting any benefit of it. So, you know,
that's why you need separate windows, particular guidelines.
Yeah, and intermediaries. So the response was, okay, so how do we fix that? Let's put people in place that help them access it. Let's have different funding windows into that pool of money.
But that didn't prevent, in at least 3 cases I'm aware, in France, Spain and Morocco, of corruption and of big companies creating even their own intermediate bodies to get back the money that they were paying, because they were. So I think, of course, that's the case. But I think the fact that some countries are considering the levy and the training fund as a collaboration and partnership rather than just a source of funding seems to me the major difference, and that can make impact on the quality of the apprenticeship, on its scale, on its relevance.
Is there anyone who wants to come in with something different? I've got a question I want to ask the panelists, but before I do so, I'm just wondering if there's anything from the floor which on these issues which you'd like to ask anyone. Okay, well perhaps I can press on. I mean, I think it would be interesting. I mean, perhaps leaving aside the training fund for the moment and looking elsewhere, it would be interesting to try and give a kind of a concrete example of what employer engagement looks like when it's successful in a particular country within your experience. Just so we can then reflect about whether that's much the same as what it looks like when we see it in Europe and the UK and the States, or whether it's actually a bit different. So just as a kind of experiment, I mean, Bohrene, can I ask you to start off, and we'll go the other way?
Let me give an example of a country that is so far from here. Let me take Chile. And I think there is one interesting example where, and just in a nutshell, the historical perspective, the mining sector in Chile is one that's driving the economy. And it was multinational companies that were based in Chile and using the natural resources. And they were poaching workers. So they were not investing in training, just, no, you got a worker, I take it, etc. And then the government was trying to get them working together, and they have created, and then to make a long story short, they created a foundation, which is not a government organization, it's like an association, which, and it's called Fundación Chile, and that foundation has brought together all those competing multinational, brought together training providers, and created a platform for collaboration, but for an independent collaboration from the government influence. So it's kind of a neutral platform. And that foundation created, in a way, capacities for skills development, specific qualifications, and the most recent work that I found very, very interesting is they have developed a new strategy calling it from COBOL to innovation. And the idea is that the mining sector has to move the value chain. They have to develop more innovation. And that foundation is trying to see how skills, entrepreneurship, and innovation can reinforce or can develop the mining sector. So this is an example. It's not a sectoral council. It's not a kind of institutionalized whatever mechanism within Ministry of Labor, or it's an independent institution where employers were coming, but also training providers.
Interesting. Thank you. Karina, can you?
Right, actually I'm going to, I'll be brief, but I want to mention a few. Fundación Chile, I was there about 15 years ago, and what fascinated me about that was I was working at that time at the Australian National Training Authority. I walked into their office and there were the Australian training packages lined up with a translator. For at that time, $147 plus postage and handling. They purchased them, this was before the web, but purchased them and had them shipped over. Someone was translating them and they were going through, starting the validation. So whereas in Australia we'd spent a lot of money and several years asking everybody in the, say, mining industry, what would this look like, what were the competency standards, they took it, translated it, went straight to validation and said, you know, does this look right? Tweak this a bit, tweak that a bit. And I thought that was a terrific example actually, but what they were then doing was they were going to companies and saying, trial this. So what they were doing was sidestepping what would have been a very, very slow government process and going straight as though they were a government.
Right.
Going and engaging with companies and saying, how about this? So my best tip actually is, having said I work for an organisation where our client is government, is I see repeatedly some of the best examples are outside of government when you're using outside organisations to do things which a government in a highly developed country with lots of money and expertise might do, but in a developing country context isn't. Another one would be China, where Microsoft have got direct links with a number of universities, and they're effectively training their next generation of workers for Microsoft. IBM are doing the same in India. They're going straight in to do something which they're working around a market failure, if you like, but it's not a market failure, it's actually a government failure. And they're just going in and doing it. And there's numerous examples I could give of that type. And I think that's fascinating. The question, of course, is how you replicate and institutionalise.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting question there about, whether or not. I think if you leave aside the question of informality, because it's about the structure of the economy and who the employers are, whether or not the challenge of employer engagement in developing countries is any fundamentally different to what it is in developed countries, and in some ways I don't think it is. Perhaps the firms are competing in different sorts of markets, so the angle for the employers to engage with skills issues is a harder barrow to push, but then there are segments of every developed economy where you talk skills to an employer and they don't want to talk to you. So in some ways it's different, but in other ways it's not. In terms of the good examples that I'd share, and then I sort of touched on it yesterday, an example from Bangladesh. We've been working there for a few years now with the support of the European Commission. Really ambitious. Okay, let's reform your whole skills system in 5 years. Let's introduce a national qualifications framework. Competency-based training, new sector industry skills councils. We'll introduce an apprenticeship system. It was really quite an ambitious thing. But what it did do, in some of the sectors it failed, even though we went through the analysis and clearly skills was an issue for them. Just the potential for collaboration in some sectors didn't pay off, but in a couple it did. In the leather sector, leather goods, so footwear and other things, Bangladesh is a pretty big producer. The employers came together on the basis of a cluster. They set up a training organisation under the wing of the Industry Skills Council. and basically introduced a new apprenticeship program. And the centre provided the off-the-job training component. There was a cluster of enterprises that said, we'll take X number, we'll take Y number, you know, and they managed the kind of supply chain through to their members because they were having such a large labour turnover issue. And so it was really out of self-interest because they were having troubles with recruitment. They stepped in, they took advantage of some technical assistance there, but there was a market failure. There was no training organisation in the country actually servicing the leather industry. You couldn't do leather training even if you wanted to. You know, it was quite proactive, and it was led by very senior business owners who had some sort of connections, but they really saw the potential that their sector had, and so they were passionate, sort of, you know, in their engagement. And they've trained, you know, 8,000 to 10,000 apprentices just in that cluster. They're setting up an outreach centre in another one of the major urban centres in Chittagong. So I think, you know, part of that is also about getting them to see what the potential is. And I think in a development context, sharing international experiences does become important because, you know, it's not like, oh, well, you have to do it this way. It really is a bit of policy learning rather than policy borrowing, but they're in a unique position because they can cherry pick a bit.
Yes.
You know, and they can say, okay, well, we like this bit that's going on in Germany, or we like that bit in Australia or wherever, the UK. So let's try and combine that in a different way. So in some ways they're in a more liberated position, but they're obviously the system around them is not as capable of supporting.
I think there's an enormous freedom in that chaos. There really is great opportunity to do things, and it's a cherry pick. And another example, to give a positive one about government.
Good.
In Bangladesh, project ADB is working on. Bangladesh government just borrowed $350 million from ADB to reform its Tibet system, its skills system. I mean, it is a large country. With Nepal, we're talking 20 million. But with Bangladesh, it's 350 million, and they'll go for top-up funding for that in a couple of years' time. But the frustration of the employers couldn't give confidence that the public system was going to respond sufficiently to their demand, and therefore ADB has shifted usual practice, which is often more supply side because we're working with the governments, and using existing Chamber of Commerces, has actually given those Chamber of Commerces the power to allocate the funds to the training system. So a bit akin to the New Zealand system from some years ago, for those who may be familiar with that. So this is quite a radical shift, and it's done in partnership with government as a mechanism to kickstart the providers, whether they be public or private, but with clear messaging from the Chambers of Commerce. So it's not setting up new sector skills councils, which is, which is a long and involved process.
That's what we did last decade. That was last decade, where we were doing something different.
Yes, yeah, we'll give this a go. The organisations already exist. They are already there. They already have their networks. They already meet and know what's going on in their own industry. So this was a way to say to those existing networks, where do you think the money for garment industry or this, that, the other, shipbuilding should go? Anyway, wait and see.
I think there is a point here, because most of the interventions go into capacitating governments, colleges, wherever intermediate body, but there are very few resources that go into capacitating employers, organization, chambers, association of crafts. I think there is a huge mismatch and imbalance between the investment that is done on the public in a broader sense and in the private. And I think, I mean, picking on an example of a project that I was involved when I was at EDF, we supported the Moroccan ready-made garment sector and federation. And in a way, the program was not toward schools, but it was toward the federation.
Yeah.
Because the federation played an important role in putting enterprises together, in identifying the skills needs, and in setting like a kind of a memorandum of understanding between the federation and the training providers. And I think that type of intervention is lacking. In most of the projects, you have a lot of teacher training, you have a lot of colleges, leaders, capacity development, but very few, if any, capacity development of chambers, federation, because there is an assumption that they are able to express their needs, they are well organized, but in reality it's not the case. And I think that type of intervention is very important.
I think there are some interesting opportunities here. I mean, if we're just trying to reflect on what's different about the developing transition country context, I'm just putting a few things together. And we said, okay, we've got an extra dimension in that you may have got donors and international organizations who can, maybe say, okay, you've got to have stakeholder involvement, you've got to bring businesses to the table, and that may not be happening, outside. We've also got this issue of having enthusiasm at sector level, which can be a strong driver, where maybe the centre is a bit overloaded, the centre's got too much on its plate, it's got too many issues to really get down to thinking about skills in sectoral context. And the trouble, of course, is you get it in some sectors but not others. In some sectors there are leaders who are ambitious, who want to take control, and maybe a donor or an agency can come together with them and support them. What's more difficult is to do that systematically, because it's opportunistic. I mean, that's not to say it doesn't work, but it is, And then I suppose the other thing which is mentioned is this business of international companies, and about how that can be a special dimension, what they can bring and what they can expect. So just a few things about what doing this in the developing transition context. So Paul, I cut you off.
No. Look, I mean, for us, we're really keen on the sectoral approaches sort of model. But at the same time, I guess it's a question of how you balance the local with with the sectoral and then with the national and what's happening here with devolution of funding. In terms of purchasing, what's happened with the sector skills councils, moving away from that, and then the apprenticeship levy reinforcing a very much enterprise kind of thing. But so that kind of dynamic and the shifting sort of patterns there, I think is interesting, and we're doing some work with the OECD at the moment in their LEAD program, which is very much focused on that kind of skill ecosystem concept. How do you bring together the different actors at a local level, and then the tension between negotiating solutions at a local level and some sort of sector or national framework, I think is a real challenge, and you sort of get torn between what are you focusing on, just giving a response to an enterprise and letting them because that's where people get employed, that's where skills are deployed, or is it about this sort of sector development? Is it about
what do you think of this smart territories idea? I mean, just to throw another one in, I mean, the smart territories concept is that there's kind of another way. You don't have to choose between them, kind of. That you can build coordination at a sort of territorial, to sub-national, maybe sub-regional territorial level, whereby local government, third sector organisations, business, labour organisations. The argument is it's a kind of fertile area for looking at skills, because there's a kind of shared. I don't know. Is that a brave new hope? What do you think? I mean,
we have created a brand. Please.
Yeah, sorry. That's exactly the point I was just going to make. I'm based in Ireland. I work as an independent skills consultant. And about a year ago, we've had our crisis from 2008, and now you're probably reading the Wall Street Journal that Ireland is booming again and all that nonsense. However, a year ago, the government decided to establish regional skills forums exactly for this purpose of addressing what Karina you talked about and what McKinsey have a brilliant report on, which is the disconnect between what employers, the attitudes of employers towards education and vice versa, and also the attitude of people who are being educated and the disconnect that's there. So what we've done in Ireland, and I sit on the board of one of the regional skills forums. There are 8 regions in Ireland. We have 8 regional skills forums. So the ministries are in the forums, the employer bodies, both SME and the multinationals. There are 2 targeted employers, so like an anchor employer which is based in that region. We have the people from the universities, we have people from the vocational sector, and various other people on those forums. And in the first instance, it is a forum. So it's an opportunity for people to come together. So you've got all the silos. So we're only in the first 6 months of the one in the region where I'm in. So people are still, a bit insecure and holding back and so on. But the idea is that eventually, when you have an established forum, that it starts then to deal with what's the skill issue that we have. How do we overcome the disconnect? How do we bridge the gap between what employers demand and what educators supply, etc., etc., etc.? And it's, you said it was smart.
Smart territory is the jargon.
So we have a smart territory strategy. When I tell our guy who runs it, when I go back. But that's, so that's an example of, it's not the question you asked, which is what does it look like? So in my experience on pilot traineeships between employers and TVET bodies in Ireland, the best ones are the ones where when they all get into a room, you don't know which one is the employer and which one is from the TVET institute or college, and I've seen that, and it's fantastic when you see somebody from a college assessing somebody in a workplace. And you thought that the guy was working there for 20 years when he's actually from a college. So that's what it can look like when it's really successful. And hopefully down the line, the idea with these regional skills forums is that it will be a pure example of collaboration and where there isn't even a gap. We don't have a gap or a disconnect, which is a bit of a utopian thing, but however,
that's exciting, but it's alive in Ireland. Okay, so I'm aware of the clock, so what I'm going to invite everyone on the panel to do is just say a few words to wind up, because I think we
Are we finishing?
And why didn't we finish at 1:45?
We started at 1:45.
Oh, hang on, yeah, same with both clocks, yeah. So just a few words from each person on the panel, and then we'll let people go on the next session. So,
just maybe to finish on this point, we have created like a kind of a word called learning cities. And the idea is, I mean, it's not only about vocation, but it's really to see how local authorities, how the mayors and other stakeholders can be engaged in supporting lifelong learning. Okay. And giving that kind of an international brand, so that it's about peer learning, but it's also about encouraging cities. When I say city, it can be even a village. But the idea is that in addition to the national policies, you have to see something happening on the ground, and that bottom-up approach can be as well as fertile and as worth investing in it as a kind of top-down approach.
Okay, thank you. Karina, last few words?
Did you want to comment on that one? Something different. Okay. I'm going to put a contrary view to the learning environment, smart territories, ecosystems, whatever. Based on to come back to your question, Julian, about what are some of the differences between a developing country and more developed. Looking at some of the least developed countries that I work with in Asia, or some of the least developed parts of countries, one of the things that characterises that difference is that the workers are global. So the globalisation of labour at the lower end is unstoppable and is now acknowledged as an industry. So the government of Kerala in India came to ADB and said, we've got great education system, we don't have enough jobs, we'll never have enough jobs, our people are the workers for the world, so we want them to finish university and then do a 3-month program in employability skills in English and IT and communication with this and send them off to the world. Other places do the same. The Philippines, where I live, trains many more nurses than you can ever hope to absorb into the Philippine health system. They are training for the world. So on the one hand, and you see it all over the developing, in the least developed areas, so on the one hand, in the more developed economies, we are looking at these smart territories and how to make things hum along.
Mm-hmm.
In some of the least developed, you're preparing workers for a life outside of where they live. In India, that might be from Bihar down to Calcutta, and in other places, it's from somewhere to the Gulf.
Okay,
I mean, you know, that's a whole separate topic in its own right, isn't it? But I just want to come back and fully agree with the local thing, but have a pitch for the sector. And I think, you know, why it's important to engage employers at a sectoral level is to send clear signals about what qualifications are required within a sector. And I think one of the better things about the Australian system is how the sector skills councils have really done away with this proliferation of qualifications in the labour market. That, you know, here you've got awarding bodies, you've got 10,000 qualifications out there. In Australia, in the sector, you'll have 20 qualifications, and that's it. And if you're a provider, they're the qualifications that you choose from. So the use of a qualification as a communication tool, and the use of an NQF as a communication tool, is a bit tighter, because it's saying, for this occupation, we want this qualification, or maybe, you know, there's some variations, and you can structure it in a different way. But I think, you know, that's a strong argument for engaging at that sectoral level, is to do that job that someone has to do, to structure qualifications, to link it with occupations, and to provide a framework that says this is what we want in our sector. Because otherwise you're not doing any service to your members or individual enterprises who are still confronted with that confusion of different providers. What's the difference between that qualification and that qualification?
Paul, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah,
I'm aware of the audience. Thank you very much indeed.